It was a late September morning when Jake, Olivia, and their friends Brandon and Mia drove into the remote mountains of Pennsylvania, planning a weekend hike along Ravens Hollow Trail. The trail was notorious among local hikers for its isolation and the stories that clung to it. Tales of hikers who vanished, strange lights in the woods, and the echoing cries of something unseen. Jake, the thrill seeker of the group, laughed at the warnings. "Urban legends," he said. "This is going to be fun." The parking area was little more than a gravel clearing beside a narrow dirt road. Mist lingered in the valleys below, and the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves was thick in the morning air. They hoisted their packs and started up the trail, the path winding through dense forest. The sunlight flickered through the canopy, casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. At first, the hike was normal, even enjoyable. Brandon carried a small drone, hoping to capture aerial shots of the ridge, while Mia and Olivia joked about who would be fastest up the incline. The path was uneven but manageable, roots and rocks forcing careful footing. After a couple of miles, the trail narrowed and the forest grew darker, the trees packed so tightly that even midday sunlight barely penetrated. A quiet tension settled over the group. They began hearing noises that didn't belong, faint rustling behind them, the occasional snap of a branch, though no one was there. "I swear I just saw someone move between those trees," Olivia whispered. Jake shook his head. "It's just a deer or something. Keep moving." But then they came across a clearing, and it wasn't empty. In the center lay an old, abandoned campsite. Rusted camping gear, scorched wood, and a few scattered belongings were strewn about. A small journal rested on a rock, pages yellowed and corners chewed. Brandon picked it up and started reading. The entries were frantic, describing hikers who had gotten lost, hearing whispers calling their names, and glimpsing shadowy figures that seemed to follow them. The final pages were almost illegible, smeared with dirt and something darker. "This is creepy," Mia said, her voice trembling. "We should leave." Jake insisted they keep going, trying to brush off the unease, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the wind carried faint whispers, almost intelligible, repeating their names. By mid-afternoon, the trail became steep and treacherous. The forest grew silent, the birds gone, and the air heavy. Visibility was reduced by low-hanging fog that seemed to appear from nowhere. Jake led, but even he was starting to feel the unease gnaw at him. Suddenly, Olivia froze. There's someone there," she stammered, pointing. A figure stood among the trees, tall, thin, and unnervingly still. It had no discernible face, just a dark void, and its limbs bent at impossible angles. It didn't move, but radiated an oppressive presence. Brandon raised his drone, hoping to capture footage, but the figure vanished the moment he turned the camera toward it. Panic began to ripple through the group. As the sun dipped lower, they stumbled upon a derelict cabin, its wood rotting and windows broken. Against better judgment, Jake suggested they take shelter for a short break. Inside, the air was stale and damp. Scratches and symbols marred the walls, and in the center of the floor lay a circle of stones containing ashes and small bones. A low growl reverberated from outside. The cabin door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible chant. Then it appeared, a shadowy figure, impossibly thin, with limbs bending at unnatural angles, gliding toward them silently. Its void-like face was featureless, and the presence of it alone filled the cabin with icy dread. Jake tried the door. It was locked. Brandon screamed, pounding the walls, but it was futile. Mia clung to Olivia, trembling as the figure moved closer. In a desperate act, Olivia smashed a window and they climbed out, stumbling into the dense fog outside. The forest had changed. Trees twisted into shapes that seemed impossible. The path they thought they knew vanished. Every step led them deeper into the wilderness. The whispers followed, circling them, accompanied by flashes of shadow moving just beyond vision. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Exhaustion overtook reason. Mia suggested splitting up to find help faster. Reluctantly, Jake and Olivia agreed. Mia disappeared into the mist, leaving them alone in the unnatural forest. Finally, just as dawn broke, Jake and Olivia emerged onto a faint dirt road. A passing vehicle stopped for them. They were covered in mud and scratches, clothes torn, and faces pale with terror. Authorities were called, but Mia and Brandon were never found. Reports from locals spoke of unnatural shapes seen in the mist of Raven's Hollow, strange chanting echoing through the trees, and hikers disappearing without a trace. Even years later, Jake and Olivia never hiked again. At night, Olivia could still hear whispers in the wind, see shadows moving at the edges of her vision, and feel the gaze of something featureless watching from the dark. No matter how far she ran, she knew the forest had marked them and that it was still waiting for the next unwary hiker. Story: the end. It was a crisp October morning when Tyler, Megan, and Sam arrived at the trailhead for Redstone Pass, a secluded hiking path in the Oregon Cascades. The three had been planning the hike for weeks, drawn by stories of untouched forests, rocky ridges, and a waterfall hidden deep within the trail. The air was sharp, scented with damp pine, and the faint mist clinging to the trees gave everything an ethereal quality. Tyler, usually the most cautious of the group, had a persistent feeling in his chest that made him tense, though he forced a smile and chalked it up to nerves. The first few miles were deceptively serene. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss on fallen logs. Sam laughed at a chipmunk darting across the trail, while Megan paused to photograph the vibrant autumn leaves. Tyler kept his eyes scanning the forest edges, noting subtle movements in the shadows, branches bending oddly, shapes that vanished when he tried to focus on them. He didn't mention it to the others. He didn't want to ruin the day. By late morning, they reached a narrow footbridge spanning a rushing creek. Sam led the way, joking as he leapt from plank to plank. Megan followed carefully, and Tyler trailed, listening to the gurgling water below. That's when he heard it. A low, rasping sound, like someone dragging their feet through wet leaves, coming from the dense forest on the far side of the creek. He froze, heart hammering, and squinted into the shadows, but nothing was visible. "Tyler, are you okay?" Megan asked, noticing his pallor. "I think I heard something," he replied, forcing himself to sound calm. "Probably just the creek or a branch falling." Sam shrugged and moved on, but Tyler couldn't shake the feeling. As they continued, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trail narrowed, roots snaking across the path like writhing veins. The sunlight dimmed as the canopy thickened, and a sudden chill ran through Tyler's body. He kept glancing behind him, half expecting to see movement, half fearing what he might find. Around mid-afternoon, they stumbled into a small clearing. The remains of an old campsite lay there, a collapsed tent, rusted cooking gear, and, most disturbingly, symbols etched into nearby trees and rocks. Tyler's stomach turned. They weren't natural, jagged lines forming patterns that felt deliberately ominous. Maybe we should keep moving?" Megan suggested, her voice tight. "Yeah," Tyler agreed. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Sam, ever curious, knelt to examine the markings closer, ignoring Tyler's warning. That's when the first scream tore through the forest, a raw, guttural sound that froze them in place. Tyler felt his stomach drop. "We need to go. Now." They turned back toward the trail, but something was different. The path no longer looked familiar. Trees seemed twisted, shadows longer and darker. The fog began rolling in, thick and clinging to the underbrush. Tyler heard whispers then, faint, layered, calling their names in distorted tones. Tyler, Megan, Sam. Panic set in. They ran blindly, calling out to each other. Branches whipped against their faces, roots tripped them, and the forest seemed to shift around them, looping them back to the clearing with the symbols. Tyler tripped over a root and hit the ground hard. When he looked up, Sam was gone. Megan's terrified cry echoed from somewhere unseen. Through the fog, shapes began to emerge. Tall, thin, impossibly still, they moved with a grace that made no sound. Their faces were featureless, pale and tilted unnaturally, eyes voids that seemed to pierce Tyler's soul. He scrambled backward, tripping over the uneven terrain, desperate to escape, but the shapes advanced deliberately, patient, surrounding the clearing. Tyler called Megan's name. She stumbled into view, her expression frozen in terror, limbs stiff and bent at impossible angles. Sam appeared next, slumped against a tree, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Tyler gagged, horror rooting him in place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, layered over one another, promising pain and inevitability. Tyler tried to flee, but the forest itself seemed to conspire against him. Every step led him back to the clearing, back to the symbols, back to the shapes. Desperate, he ran blindly, branches clawing at his clothes, mud and leaves tearing at his skin. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Exhausted and bleeding, Tyler finally stumbled onto a narrow service road. A search party was in the distance, flashlights cutting through the mist. He ran toward them, collapsing into their arms, trembling, unable to speak. Authorities later found Megan and Sam. Their bodies were intact but horrifyingly frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Limbs twisted, eyes wide, faces pale and lifeless. No cause of death could be determined, and the forest remained silent, fog creeping constantly along the trail, the trees dark and still. Tyler never hiked again. He moved across the country, changed his phone number, tried to bury the memory, but at night he hears the whispers, sees the twisted shapes at the edge of vision, and feels the dragging presence in his dreams. He knows the forest is patient, intelligent, waiting for the next hikers foolish enough to wander into Redstone Pass, and he knows without a doubt that they will come for them too. Story the end. The first time I set foot on Raven Creek Trail, it was early October, and the chill in the Appalachian air carried the faint scent of decaying leaves. I had been itching for a solo hike for weeks, needing to escape the suffocating city life in Nashville. Friends had warned me it was a difficult, remote trail, but that was exactly why I wanted to go. My backpack was minimal: water, some trail mix, a flashlight, and my phone with a full battery. I told myself I was prepared. The trailhead was unassuming, barely marked by a warped wooden post. The path twisted into the dense forest, flanked by thick underbrush and towering oaks. At first, everything was serene. The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, sunlight filtering through the canopy. I moved quickly, boots crunching over wet leaves, enjoying the solitude. After about 45 minutes, the forest grew quieter. Birds disappeared, and even the wind seemed muted. Shadows pooled in unnatural ways, stretching across the trail and shifting when I wasn't looking. My chest tightened, but I kept going, insisting that it was just being alone in the woods. Then I noticed the first oddity. Scattered along the path were small items: an old shoe, a cracked water bottle, a single glove. They appeared deliberately placed like markers, and my stomach churned. I tried to rationalize it. Someone must have lost them recently. But the deeper I went, the more unsettling the trail became. I heard it next, a soft rustling behind me. I froze. The sound stopped. I moved faster, and it resumed, persistent, following me. My pulse hammered in my ears. About an hour in, I came to a clearing. A campsite lay in ruins, a collapsed tent, a cold fire pit, and scattered debris, broken containers, scraps of fabric, a notebook with pages torn out. My stomach turned. I felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. I turned to leave, but the path I had taken no longer looked familiar. The forest had shifted, or perhaps I had simply wandered too far off course. Then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush, mimicking my own pace. I spun around, heart hammering, but the dense trees revealed nothing. My rational mind whispered that it could be another hiker, lost like me, but the cadence of the steps was wrong, too precise, too deliberate, almost mechanical. Panic took over. I ran blindly through the woods, tripping over roots and rocks. My ankle twisted on a hidden root, and I fell into a shallow ravine, scraping my arms and knees. I lay there, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a wet, low rustling that made my stomach twist. Then I saw them. 3 figures, impossibly tall and thin, emerged from between the trees. Their limbs bent at unnatural angles, and shadows hid their faces. They didn't speak or move with purpose, but I could feel their awareness pressing in, suffocating and oppressive. My body froze. One of them bent down slightly, tilting its head as if studying me. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, stretching beyond human limits. No sound came, but the threat was palpable. I wanted to flee, but my legs refused. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. I forced myself up, dragging my injured ankle along the forest floor, following what I hoped was the right trail. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The forest darkened unnaturally, shadows twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. Every corner I turned, I thought I glimpsed them again, always at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I tried to look directly. Eventually, I stumbled onto a small road. My car was still there. I collapsed inside, shaking and exhausted. I drove home without looking back, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ankle. Weeks later, I attempted to explain what happened, but no one believed me. They suggested hallucinations, imagination, stress, But I knew what I had seen. The forest, the ruined campsite, the figures, they were real. I returned once with a friend, hoping to prove it was all in my head. We found the trailhead, but the path had vanished, overgrown with dense foliage as though it had never existed. Then we heard it, footsteps following us, deliberate, echoing through the trees. We ran, terror propelling us, until we reached a main road. My friend swore she saw them too, the tall, thin silhouettes, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us vanish into the distance. I never hike alone anymore. I avoid forests entirely. But the memory haunts me. Shadows twist unnaturally in my apartment, and at night I hear faint footsteps outside my window. The forest is still out there, waiting. Some places aren't just dangerous, they're wrong. They remember you and they wait. The footsteps never truly leave. Story, the end. The sun was just beginning to rise when I parked at the trailhead in the remote backcountry of the Smoky Mountains. It was early November, the mornings crisp, the air thick with fog that clung to the slopes like a shroud. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks, a 2-night trek along an unmaintained section of trail, far from any other hikers. I wanted isolation, silence, a break from the constant noise of my life in Atlanta. I double-checked my pack, water, energy bars, my small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, and my knife. Boots laced tight, jacket zipped, I stepped onto the trail. The path was narrow, flanked by dense woods and slick with fallen leaves and early frost. Mist hung between the trees, muffling sound and turning the world into a soft gray haze. The first miles passed uneventfully. I moved quickly, relishing the solitude. Birdsong echoed faintly, and a deer darted across the trail in the distance, pausing to watch before disappearing into the woods. The forest smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a comfort I hadn't realized I'd missed. Around mid-morning, I noticed something strange. On a muddy section of the trail were footprints too large to be mine, and oddly shaped as if the toes were splayed in different directions. They led off the main path into the dense trees. I froze, scanning the surrounding forest. No one was there. My rational mind tried to dismiss it. Animal tracks, maybe. But the size and shape were wrong for any wildlife I knew. I continued, unease gnawing at me. The trail grew steeper, more rugged, roots twisting across the path like natural snares. By early afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream, a place I planned to use for my first night. I unpacked, pitched my tent, and gathered firewood. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows stretched unnaturally as the sun began to set. Twisted branches and unusual marks on tree trunks surrounded the clearing. Then I saw them, footprints encircling the tent, some massive, some small and irregular. None matched any human foot. I froze, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. Night fell, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I lit a small fire, the flames casting weak, flickering light. Around 9 p.m. I heard it, a soft rustling, deliberate and slow, circling the campsite. My flashlight revealed nothing but trees. A shape, a tall, thin figure, flickered between the trees, moving without sound. Every time I thought I saw it clearly, it vanished. I retreated into the tent, zipped tight, trying to calm myself. The rustling continued sporadically, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Then a whisper, low and flat, carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze. The voice had no accent, no emotion, just a statement. I gripped my flashlight and knife, but fear had rendered me almost paralyzed. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Every small sound made me flinch, a twig snapping, leaves brushing, wind rattling through the branches. Around 2 a.m. I dozed lightly, only to wake to deliberate footsteps circling my tent. I held my breath, listening, unable to move. Another whisper, "I can see you." Dawn broke, pale and gray. The forest seemed to sigh, the rustling finally stopping. I peeked outside cautiously. Footprints surrounded the tent completely, some grotesquely large, others small and twisted, and all leading inward toward my hiding spot. On nearby trees were symbols, circles, jagged lines, faces, scratched deep into the bark, some fresh and dark with sap. I didn't linger. I packed quickly and ran, blindly following the trail downhill. My legs burned, slipping on wet leaves and roots. Behind me, I thought I heard soft footsteps, always following, circling, patient. Hours later, I stumbled onto a more maintained section of trail and finally reached the trailhead. My Jeep was still there, empty and normal, but my hands shook and I could barely breathe. I tried to dismiss it once home: stress, imagination, isolation. But strange things began happening. Shadows in my apartment seemed to move independently. At night, the wind carried whispers: "You shouldn't be here." My camera, untouched, sometimes captured blurry figures in the background. I haven't hiked alone since. I never will. The forest left a mark on me, and I can still feel it, patient and watching, lurking at the edges of reality. Some woods are not just empty, they are alive, and they follow you home. Even now, when the wind rattles my windows, I hear it. Soft, flat, insistent. You shouldn't be here. I had always been drawn to isolated trails, the kind of hikes where the only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. That's why I chose Raven's Hollow Trail in the remote mountains of Tennessee. Locals warned me about it, said it was easy to get lost, that hikers sometimes wandered off and never returned, but I dismissed their stories as superstition. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot near the trailhead just after dawn, the mist curling around the trees like tendrils, and slung my pack over my shoulders. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet pine and moss. The first few miles were quiet, but not peaceful. There was a stillness to the forest, a weight that pressed against me. Birds chirped intermittently, but every so often a sharp silence would drop over the trees, unnatural and heavy. As I climbed higher, the trail narrowed, roots and rocks twisting into almost deliberate obstacles. That's when I noticed it. A faint metallic smell in the air, almost like rust, barely perceptible at first. I told myself it was just runoff from the rocks, something natural, and kept walking. By midday, the sun had begun to dip behind the peaks, but the forest didn't darken normally. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, bending around the trees. I stopped at a small clearing to catch my breath and noticed something unsettling. The trail I had been following was gone. Where I thought the path continued, there was only dense underbrush, thorny brambles, and trees packed so closely together it seemed impossible to move forward. I backtracked, hoping to find the familiar trail, and that's when I heard the whisper. It was soft, hoarse, almost inaudible. "Over here," it called, dragging the words out like a warning or an invitation. My pulse quickened. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the forest. I moved cautiously toward the sound, branches scraping at my arms and face, my boots sinking into loose soil. The whispers became more distinct, forming syllables I didn't recognize, but that carried intent. There was movement in the trees, subtle but deliberate. I glimpsed a figure, thin, tall, shadowed, standing between the trunks, barely visible, yet I could feel its gaze on me. My stomach turned. I tried to retreat, but the forest seemed to shift, rearranging itself, paths twisting where they shouldn't, landmarks vanishing. I stumbled onto a small clearing, and my blood ran cold. In the center lay a shallow pit, the earth clotted and dark. Around it were crude symbols carved into the nearby trees, jagged, uneven, almost screaming in their chaos. I could feel it before I saw it, a presence, oppressive and patient, waiting. The whispers grew louder, circling me, pressing against my mind, and then the footsteps started. Heavy, uneven, not human. They pressed into the soil, deep and deliberate, moving closer. I ran, branches clawing at my clothes, roots tripping me, shadows flitting at the edge of my vision. Every turn led me deeper into the forest, the trail now a labyrinth of twisting paths that shouldn't exist. Night fell suddenly. My flashlight barely illuminated the immediate area. The whispers were all around me now, almost deafening, urging, mocking, calling my name. I tripped over a hidden root and fell into a shallow ravine, scraping my arms and legs. When I looked up, I saw them. Figures, tall and impossibly thin, their limbs bent in unnatural ways, moving silently through the trees. One stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of a face, featureless, glistening with something wet, blacker than night. I screamed and ran blindly. Hours passed, though it could have been minutes. Dawn broke as I stumbled onto a familiar ridge, barely able to stand. The main trail was ahead, and I ran until I saw my truck, parked where I had left it. I drove home without stopping, hands white on the wheel, heart pounding. Weeks later, I still smell it, the metallic, acrid tang lingering on my clothes, on my skin. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, calling my name. I know that something waits in Raven's Hollow, patient, hungry, and it will never forget me. I will never hike there again. Story the end. It was early November when my friends Matt, Sarah, and I decided to hike a little-known trail in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. We were drawn to the area for its remoteness, hoping to escape the noise of the city for a weekend. The trailhead was nearly deserted, and the air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. We had planned a 2-day hike with a small campsite near a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. What we didn't know was that the mountains had a way of changing those plans, twisting them into something far more sinister. We started hiking around 8 a.m., backpacks loaded with food, water, and camping gear. The first few miles were scenic and peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Matt kept a steady pace, while Sarah and I lagged slightly behind, joking about ghost stories and urban legends related to the mountains. The trail was quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of a squirrel to break the silence. Around mid-morning, we noticed the forest becoming denser. Trees grew taller, their branches gnarled and twisted, blocking out more sunlight. The trail narrowed and the underbrush thickened, making progress slower. That's when Sarah stopped abruptly, staring into the trees. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Matt shrugged. "Probably just a shadow or a deer." But there was a feeling, an unease that hung over the forest like a heavy fog. I realized we weren't alone. By midday, we reached a small clearing where a creek cut through the trail. We paused to rest, drink, and eat, but the air felt heavier, colder, and charged in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its head was cocked to one side, and its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the filtered light. I froze. Sarah gasped, and Matt looked where we were pointing, but the figure had vanished, leaving only the stillness of the forest behind. We pressed on, but the forest seemed to change around us. Trails that should have been familiar twisted back on themselves, and landmarks disappeared. Every step we took seemed to loop us deeper into the woods. The rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs followed us relentlessly, always just beyond sight. By late afternoon, panic began to set in. The sun was low, the fog thicker, and shadows stretched unnaturally. The air carried whispers that we couldn't identify, voices that seemed to echo just behind us. Matt tried to calm us, insisting we follow a stream downhill to find the main trail, but the stream seemed endless, bending in directions that didn't make sense. Night fell, and the forest became a maze of shadows. We set up a small camp in a clearing, but sleep was impossible. Every sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, the faint echo of breathing, made our hearts race. Hours passed like days. Around 2 a.m., Sarah screamed. I swung my flashlight toward her direction and saw it. One of the figures, crouched behind a tree, its elongated limbs bent at impossible angles, head cocked unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly orange in the beam. The air vibrated with a low, guttural hum. We ran blindly into the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks. The figure moved with inhuman speed, always just out of reach. The snapping of branches, guttural noises, and whispers followed us. We had no sense of direction, the forest seemingly rearranging itself to keep us trapped. By dawn, we stumbled onto a logging road. The sight of a distant cabin gave us hope. We ran to it and found signs of recent human presence. A tattered sleeping bag, empty cans, and strange markings on the walls carved in mud or soot. The smell was metallic and acrid. We didn't stay to investigate. We eventually made it to the main trail and flagged down a park ranger. The authorities launched a search for Matt, who had disappeared during the night. Despite days of searching, there was no trace of him. No footprints, no belongings, nothing. It was as if the forest had claimed him. Sarah and I escaped physically unharmed, but neither of us has returned to the mountains since. I still hear stories from hikers in that area, accounts of tall, thin figures, unnatural footprints, and whispers in the forest. Authorities dismiss them, but I know the truth. I know what waits in the woods, patient, silent, and hungry. Even now, I can't drive through the mountains without a sense of dread. Twigs snapping in the dark, shadows at the edge of my vision, and that same feeling of being watched haunt me still. The mountains are beautiful, but there's a darkness there, ancient and patient, preying on anyone foolish enough to wander too far. Story the end. It was late November when Max, his sister Kara, and their friend Leo decided to hike the remote Black Hollow Trail in the Appalachian foothills. The air was bitterly cold, the kind that burned lungs and stung fingers. The trailhead was empty, except for a few scattered leaves drifting in the wind. Max checked his pack one last time: water, snacks, headlamps, and extra clothing before they set off. The first few miles were deceptively normal. The trail wound through thick pine forests, their needles muffling footsteps. Birds called occasionally, but the forest seemed almost too quiet. Kara noticed it first. The shadows between the trees didn't move naturally. Branches twisted in ways that made her stomach churn. "Relax," Max said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just trees." Leo laughed nervously, pointing to footprints in the soft earth along the trail. They were enormous, long, wide, and splayed, and far too large for any hiker. "Probably a hunter," Leo suggested, but neither Max nor Kara was convinced. By mid-afternoon, the trail narrowed into a dense thicket. The sun barely penetrated the canopy, casting jagged shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges of their vision. Then they heard it, a wet, dragging thump behind them. It wasn't random, it matched their pace, deliberate and rhythmic. "Deer?" Leo suggested, though his voice shook. Max shook his head. "No, too big. Too intentional." Panic began to creep in as the thumping persisted, sometimes close enough that the misty undergrowth seemed to ripple with unseen movement. Every pause brought silence, every step renewed the sound. The three of them quickened their pace, hearts hammering. The trail split unexpectedly, a fork appearing that Max didn't remember seeing on the map. One path led steeply downhill, the other curved around dense, nearly impassable thickets. Before they could decide, a shadow moved in the corner of their vision. A tall, thin figure, limbs bent unnaturally, glistening wetly, as if perpetually soaked. Its face was featureless, smooth and pale, yet it tilted its head as if studying them. Kara screamed. The figure vanished into the undergrowth. They ran blindly, branches lashing their faces, roots catching their feet, until they stumbled into a clearing that should have contained a small creek according to the map. It was dry, jagged rocks scattered across the bed. No matter which way they tried to go, the trail looped back, impossibly, like the forest itself had folded around them. Night fell quickly, and the temperature plummeted. They found a small, abandoned hunting cabin and forced the door open, barricading themselves inside with fallen furniture. The air was thick with rot and mildew, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, pulsating with unseen life. Outside, the dragging sounds continued, accompanied by low, wet groans and whispers that seemed just beyond comprehension. Hours passed, or maybe days. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by visions of impossible loops and the faceless watchers lurking in the shadows. When weak morning light finally broke through the cabin's cracks, the forest had shifted. The familiar trail was gone, replaced by a dense tangle of trees and undergrowth. The footprints remained in the mud, massive and grotesque, leading deeper into the forest. Desperate, they tried to find a way out. Every path led back to the same clearing, the same dry creek, the same overwhelming feeling of being hunted. The faceless figures emerged intermittently, patient and silent, observing their every move. Eventually, they decided to descend a steep ridge toward what they hoped was civilization. The forest seemed to conspire against them, twisting paths, moving trees, and hiding landmarks. Leo slipped and struck his head on a rock, leaving a gash that bled freely. When he regained consciousness, his eyes were distant, haunted, as if he had glimpsed something beyond understanding. Finally, after hours of disoriented stumbling, they emerged onto a logging road. They collapsed onto the asphalt, exhausted, battered, hearts pounding, covered in mud and scratches. Behind them, the forest appeared ordinary, quiet, hiding the horrors they had survived. In the weeks that followed, none of them could speak of the experience without shaking. Leo refused to leave his apartment. Kara had recurring nightmares of the faceless figures and the endless loops of trees. Max tried to return to Black Hollow, but each attempt ended in panic, disorientation, and the oppressive sensation of unseen eyes watching. The trail remained ordinary to anyone else, but for them, the forest was alive, patient, and malevolent. It waited for the next hikers who strayed too far, too deep, too curious, ensuring that once someone entered its twisted heart, they would never return the same or at all. Even years later, Max would wake at night to the sound of wet, dragging footsteps outside his window, knowing the forest had not forgotten. Story the end. I left my apartment early before sunrise, with the intent to hike the Black Mountains in North Carolina. I'd done this trail a few times before, but this time I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head. I packed lightly: water, snacks, a first aid kit, flashlight, compass, and my phone. I told a coworker I'd be back by evening, though I wasn't sure if I'd even have signal to check in. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the smell of damp leaves and earth, the sun barely visible through the low-hanging clouds. The trail was familiar at first, wide, well-trodden, surrounded by a mix of oak and pine. I passed a handful of hikers early on, nodding in acknowledgement, but soon I was alone. The solitude was comforting at first, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional bird call, the wind stirring the trees. But after a few miles, the quiet began to feel unnatural, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around the third mile, the trail narrowed and the canopy thickened, cutting out most of the remaining sunlight. That's when I noticed something odd. A faint dragging sound, like a heavy object being pulled over sticks and stones, came from somewhere off the trail. My heart rate increased. I paused, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a fallen branch or a small animal and kept moving. Soon I noticed prints in the soft soil. At first glance, they appeared human, but they were irregular, too long, too wide, and spaced unevenly. Some prints veered into the underbrush, then returned to the trail as if whoever or whatever made them was circling, studying me. The forest seemed to close in, shadows stretching unnaturally as if the trees themselves were leaning closer. I pressed on, trying to reach a known clearing further up the trail. My legs burned from the steep incline, my breath heavy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The dragging sound returned, this time accompanied by a low, wet, guttural growl. It didn't move like an animal I knew. I forced myself to focus, to keep moving, but the unease pressed on my chest, tightening my lungs. Finally, I reached a small plateau where I expected to see the valley below. Instead, I found something else. Scratched into several trees were symbols, jagged, chaotic, and raw. Some resembled letters, others grotesque shapes that seemed almost alive in the fading light. My stomach twisted as I noticed more irregular footprints around the clearing, some partially filled with dirt, others fresh. The dragging noise resumed, closer now, echoing through the trees. I debated turning back, but felt an almost magnetic pull to continue along the trail. The forest grew darker, colder, and more silent with each step. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible, coming from every direction. I spun around, flashlight flickering, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, becoming a chorus that pressed in on my mind. I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin I hadn't seen on any maps. Its wooden walls were blackened with age, windows boarded, door hanging on rusted hinges. I hesitated, then entered, hoping for some form of shelter. Inside, the smell of rot and dampness was suffocating. On the floor and walls were symbols, smudged with dark, sticky material. Claw-like scratches marred the walls, deep and irregular, far larger than any animal could make. Then I heard it. The dragging again, much closer, and a whisper of my name. I froze, every muscle locked. Movement shifted in the shadows, a tall, twisted figure emerging, limbs bending unnaturally, its face obscured in darkness. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris, and scrambled through a side window, glass cutting my hands. The forest outside had become oppressive, shadows pooling unnaturally. I could feel it following me, moving with impossible precision, though I dared not look back. The whispers became a crescendo, overlapping, unintelligible, pressing into my mind. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and rocks, every step seeming to take me deeper into the woods. Eventually, I recognized a stretch of trail near the ridge I knew well. Relief surged, but it was fleeting. I looked back and saw it again, standing between the trees, unmoving, watching, its limbs twisted in unnatural ways. It didn't chase, it just waited, patient, inevitable. I reached my car, hands shaking, heart pounding. I locked the doors and started the engine, speeding down the mountain road. When I finally got home, I convinced myself it was over. Stress, exhaustion, imagination. But later that night, I heard it again. Faint, deliberate dragging at the edge of my consciousness, coming from somewhere just outside my window. I haven't slept properly since. Shadows in my apartment feel alive, Every sound outside makes my skin crawl. The symbols, the cabin, the clearing, the footprints, they haunt my dreams. I know it's still out there, waiting, watching. Even now, if I close my eyes too long, I hear the dragging across leaves, slow, deliberate, and relentless. Story, the end. The fog clung to the mountains like a living thing when I parked at the trailhead just before dawn. It was late October, the trees a riot of color, but the beauty of the Smoky Mountains did little to ease the tension I felt. I had planned this hike for weeks, a solo trek into a remote section of trail that saw almost no foot traffic. I needed to get away from everything: my apartment, my job, the constant buzz of emails and notifications. I needed the silence of the forest. I double-checked my pack: water, granola bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a compass, my knife, and a thin sleeping bag. I laced my boots, zipped my jacket, and stepped onto the trail. The fog swallowed the path, dampening sound, making every movement seem louder than it was. Leaves were slick with moisture, and the scent of wet earth was strong in the air. The first miles passed in relative calm. Birds called softly in the trees, and every so often a squirrel darted across the trail, pausing briefly to observe me. The forest seemed alive but peaceful. I welcomed the quiet, the solitude, the way the mist muted the world. By mid-morning, I noticed something unsettling. Footprints in the mud, large, wide, uneven, and oddly shaped. They didn't belong to any human boot I had ever seen, nor did they resemble animal tracks. They led off the trail into thick underbrush. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area. There was nothing, no sound, no movement. I rationalized it as a trick of the light, an old animal path, but unease coiled in my stomach. I kept moving, though slower now, my senses alert to every sound. The trail grew steep and rugged, roots and rocks jutting out to trip the unwary. By early afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream, my intended campsite. I unpacked my gear, pitched my tent, and gathered firewood, but the sensation of being watched lingered. Shadows seemed longer than they should have been. Branches twisted unnaturally, and the air felt heavy. As night fell, the forest seemed to tighten around me. I lit a small fire, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sound was deliberate, slow, moving in circles around my campsite. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, catching glimpses of something tall and thin moving between the trees. Every time I thought I saw it clearly, it vanished. I retreated into my tent, zipped closed, heart pounding, flashlight clutched in my hands. The rustling continued sporadically, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Then came a whisper, carried by the wind. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze. It wasn't my imagination. The words were deliberate, flat, emotionless. Fear rooted me in place. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. I awoke to footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. Another whisper, "I can see you." My hands shook as I gripped my knife, flashlight trembling, unable to make sense of what was happening. When dawn finally came, the forest seemed to exhale, the sounds of nature returning. I cautiously unzipped the tent and froze. Footprints surrounded my campsite completely, some grotesquely large, others small and deformed, all pointing toward the center where I had slept. On nearby trees were fresh carvings, circles, jagged lines, strange faces, some dripping sap as if marked only hours ago. I didn't linger. I packed quickly and ran, stumbling down the trail, barely paying attention to direction. Branches tore at my clothes, roots threatened my footing, and I could hear soft footsteps behind me, patient, circling, never closing the distance but never leaving. Hours later, I reached the trailhead. The Jeep was still there, ordinary and untouched, but my chest heaved and my hands shook. Back home, I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion or imagination, but strange occurrences followed me. Shadows moved in impossible ways. Whispers came with the wind. Occasionally, I found scratches or strange markings on furniture, etched as if by unseen fingers. My camera, untouched for days, sometimes contained blurred images of figures lurking in the background. I've never returned to that trail, and I never will. The forest left a mark on me, one that didn't fade when I left its physical space. Part of me remained there, watched, tracked, and patient. Some woods are alive in ways we cannot understand. They notice, they wait, and they follow. Even now, when the wind rattles my windows at night, I hear it softly, insistently. "You shouldn't be here." Story the end. It started as a spontaneous weekend trip. Kevin, Mara, and their friends, Dylan and Hannah, were itching to escape the city and tackle a lesser-known trail in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. The trail, called Black Bear Hollow, had a reputation among local hikers for its isolation. Stories of people disappearing were whispered quietly in outdoor shops, but the group, mostly in their early 20s and full of bravado, laughed them off. They parked in a small clearing near the trailhead just as the morning mist was lifting. The smell of damp leaves and pine was sharp in the cool air. Kevin led the way, map in hand, while Dylan carried a backpack stuffed with snacks and camera gear, eager to document the adventure. Mara and Hannah followed closely, joking and teasing each other about who would reach the top first. For the first few miles, the hike was uneventful. The forest was beautiful, almost serene, with golden sunlight filtering through the trees. They passed fallen logs, tiny creeks, and rocky outcrops that offered breathtaking views. But after a while, the trail began to narrow, twisting thick underbrush and over jagged roots. "I don't like how quiet it's gotten," Hannah said, glancing nervously around. "It's just the forest." Dylan replied, trying to sound confident. "We're not in a city anymore." But even as he spoke, the wind shifted, and an eerie rustling moved through the undergrowth, almost like something large was following them. Mara shivered. "I don't know. It feels wrong." Hours passed. The sunlight dimmed as the forest thickened, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. Kevin suggested a short break near a small rock formation. That's when they found it. A weathered journal, partially buried in the leaves. The pages were water-stained but legible. It filled with frantic entries detailing hikers who had gotten lost, whispering voices in the forest, and glimpses of shadowy figures watching them from a distance. The last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They come when you stray too far. Don't let them see you." Mara's stomach sank. "Maybe we should turn back," she said quietly. Kevin, as usual, shrugged. "We're almost to the ridge. Just a little farther." They pressed on, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The forest seemed to distort. Familiar trees vanished, paths looped in on themselves, and every clearing looked identical to the last. Their GPS signal was lost entirely. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin hidden behind a thick wall of trees. Its wood was gray and rotting, the windows dark and broken. Against her better judgment, Hannah suggested they rest inside, as the fog rolling through the forest made visibility almost nil. Inside, the air was musty and damp. Broken furniture lay scattered, and on the walls were deep scratches, some forming strange ritualistic symbols. In the center of the floor was a circle of stones containing ashes and fragments of bone. Kevin took a step back, feeling unease coil in his stomach. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from outside. The cabin door slammed shut violently, rattling the walls. Whispers filled the room, overlapping in a chorus of unintelligible words. Something moved in the shadows, a figure impossibly tall and thin with limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was featureless, a void that seemed to suck in the dim light. It glided toward them silently, emanating a cold, oppressive presence. Panic erupted. Kevin and Dylan tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Mara screamed, and Hannah clawed at the floorboards, but the cabin seemed alive, walls subtly warping, ceilings stretching impossibly high. The shadows around the figure lengthened, reaching toward them. In desperation, Mara smashed a window. One by one, they climbed out, stumbling into the thick fog outside. The forest had changed. Trees twisted unnaturally, paths disappeared, and the fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. Every step led them deeper into the woods rather than toward safety. The whispers followed them, circling endlessly, accompanied by glimpses of shadowy figures moving just out of sight. Exhaustion overtook reason. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Finally, Mara and Hannah stumbled onto a faint logging road just as dawn broke. Kevin and Dylan were nowhere to be seen. Authorities scoured Black Bear Hollow for days, but the two missing friends were never found. Hikers reported seeing unnatural shapes in the fog, hearing whispering voices that called their names, and glimpsing featureless figures lurking just beyond the tree line. Mara and Hannah never hiked again. At night, Mara could still hear whispers carried on the wind, see shadows flitting across her bedroom walls, and feel the oppressive gaze of something waiting silently in the darkness. No matter where she went, the memory of the forest followed, and the figure with the voided face haunted her dreams, patient and unyielding. Story the end. It was early October when four college friends, Derek, Mia, Alex, and Claire, decided to hike a rarely visited section of the Allegheny Mountains. They had all been stressed from exams, work, and the constant hum of city life, craving a weekend of isolation and adventure. Derek, who had grown up hiking these woods, promised them the perfect hidden trail where they would likely see no one else. They arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The lot was small, overgrown with grass and weeds, and the air smelled sharply of damp soil and fallen leaves. A chill ran through the clearing, but they laughed it off, unloading backpacks and strapping on boots. The trail started off narrow, winding through dense woods with the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. For the first few hours, the hike was pleasant. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds called in the distance, and small streams crossed the path. The friends joked and teased one another, stopping occasionally for pictures. But gradually, the woods grew quiet. The birds disappeared, and even the wind seemed muted. Shadows lengthened unnaturally between the trees, and Derek's usually confident sense of direction began to falter. "Are we going the right way?" Mia asked, slowing down. Her voice sounded louder in the sudden silence. "Yeah, just keep going," Derek replied, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. As the trail twisted deeper into the forest, Alex noticed something unsettling. Footprints, large and irregular, leading off the trail. "Maybe a deer?" he suggested. Mia shook her head. "No deer walk like that. Look at the spacing. It's wrong." They pressed forward, but the unease in the group grew. The trail became overgrown with twisted roots and low-hanging branches snagging clothes and skin. Every now and then, Mia swore she saw figures moving between the trees. Tall, thin shapes that vanished when she blinked. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon a small clearing. In its center stood a decaying cabin, its roof sagging and windows broken. The door hung loosely, swaying in a wind that barely moved the surrounding trees. The air smelled foul, and a heavy silence pressed in. "Do we check it out?" Claire whispered. Derek stepped forward, curiosity overcoming caution. "Just a quick look. Could be shelter if it rains." Inside, the cabin was filled with rot and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the walls were covered in strange scratches and primitive symbols. In the corner was a trapdoor, partially hidden under debris. A rancid smell seeped upward, making Mia gag. "I don't like this," she said, backing away. Derek bent down to lift the trapdoor. A narrow stairway led into darkness. At the bottom, they discovered a small basement lined with shelves of jars containing murky liquid and unidentifiable shapes. Animal bones, some charred, some arranged into patterns, were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, a circle of burned-out candles gave the impression of a ritual performed not long ago. Then came the scratching. Slow at first, deliberate, then frantic, coming from the far corner. A low, wet growl reverberated through the basement. Mia's flashlight flickered. "We're leaving. Now!" she yelled. They scrambled upstairs, but the forest outside felt wrong. Trees loomed closer together, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Fog rolled along the ground, thick and cold, curling around their ankles and legs. Panic set in as they ran. Every path seemed to loop back to the clearing with the cabin. The strange footprints followed them, crossing their trail at impossible angles. Shadows moved independently at the edge of their vision. Whispers floated through the trees, unintelligible but urgent, as if the forest itself were alive. Hours passed. Claire fell over a root, scraping her hands and knees. Derek and Alex helped her up, but she was injured badly enough that they had to support her as they pressed forward. The fog thickened, and the cold became suffocating. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt amplified. Eventually, they reached a small stream. Its water was black and still. As they crossed, something cold brushed Mia's leg, tugging slightly. She screamed, and they all panicked but managed to get across. The forest seemed to pulse around them, alive, watching, hungry. By nightfall, they reached a cliff overlooking a valley with distant town lights. Relief washed over them. But across the valley, in the dense forest below, figures appeared. Tall, humanoid but grotesque, with elongated limbs, jerky movements, and heads tilted at impossible angles. Their eyes reflected the faint moonlight like mirrors. "We can't stay here," Derek whispered, voice shaking. But we can't go down either, Claire said. They carefully descended the slope, supporting Claire. The figures followed slowly but relentlessly. Fog wrapped around their legs, pulling, dragging, resisting them. Every step became heavier, every breath more difficult. Finally, they stumbled onto an old logging road. In the distance, a lone car's headlights flickered. They ran toward it, desperate. But as they neared, the fog rolled in again. Multiple figures emerged, surrounding them. The shapes were humanoid yet grotesque, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Mia screamed as a shadow brushed past her. Derek swung a branch, but it passed through like smoke. Alex tried to help Claire, but the figures closed in. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fog lifted. The valley was visible below, bathed in morning light. Derek opened his eyes and found himself alone on the roadside. Mia, Alex, and Claire were gone. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle. Nothing. Authorities found no trace of the missing hikers. The locals avoided that part of the forest, speaking only in hushed whispers about hikers who vanished without a trace. Derek never returned. Sometimes, driving along forested roads, he swore he could see the figures at the edge of the trees, waiting, watching, and he could hear the whispers carried on the wind. You shouldn't have come here. Story the end. It was the first weekend of November when Jason, Emily, and Connor decided to hike the Ravenwood Trail, a remote path tucked deep in the forests of northern Pennsylvania. They had heard stories about the trail, how it wound through thick woods, crossed abandoned logging roads, and ended at a cliff overlooking a mist-filled valley, but no one they knew had ever completed it without feeling uneasy. Jason had shrugged off the warnings. He liked the thrill of exploring untouched forests. Emily, cautious but adventurous, followed, and Connor, the most enthusiastic of the group, carried enough gear for a week in the woods. The morning started cold, the air crisp and biting. Sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy, creating long shadows that danced over the moss-covered forest floor. They moved quickly, eager to reach the ridge before afternoon, chatting and joking to keep the mood light. But even as they laughed, Jason felt the familiar knot of unease forming in his stomach. Something about the way the trees leaned in close, the silence that swallowed all but their footsteps, made him tense. About 2 miles in, they crossed a narrow stream. Connor hopped across with ease, Emily carefully balanced, and Jason lingered to examine the water. That's when he noticed it. Footprints in the mud along the bank. They were too large to be human, and the stride was impossibly long. He knelt to look closer, heart thudding, but the footprints abruptly stopped at a tree line. Hey, check this out, Jason called to the others. Connor leaned over and whistled. Weird. Maybe an animal? No, Jason said, shaking his head. These aren't normal. Look at the spacing. Something is following the trail, or was. Emily frowned. Don't start freaking out. It's probably just some guy messing around. Jason nodded reluctantly, but a cold shiver ran down his spine. As they continued, the trail grew steeper, rocks and roots twisting across the path. The forest grew darker, even in daylight. The wind had dropped, and with it all the usual forest sounds. Birds, rustling leaves, even the babble of the stream vanished. The only sounds were their own breathing and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Around mid-afternoon, they stumbled upon a small clearing, oddly barren. The ground was trampled in places, and strange symbols had been scratched into the trees, jagged lines, circles, marks that seemed deliberately ritualistic. Jason felt a wave of dread. Guys, maybe we should turn back, he suggested. Connor laughed nervously. What, are you scared of some old tree carvings? Emily didn't answer, her eyes scanning the clearing. Something's not right, she murmured. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the forest, a deep, inhuman sound that froze Jason in place. It wasn't a human scream. It carried a chilling mix of pain and malice. Emily gasped, clutching his arm, while Connor's face went pale. We need to get out of here, Jason said firmly. They turned back to the trail, but it had changed. The trees seemed closer together, the path twisted unnaturally, and the fog had begun rolling in, thick and heavy. The clearing disappeared behind them as if the forest itself had swallowed it. Every rustle, every crack of a branch sounded amplified, and Jason swore he could hear footsteps echoing theirs, but no one was behind them. Night fell faster than expected, the fog thickening until visibility was almost zero. Jason's flashlight cut feeble beams through the mist, illuminating shadows that seemed to twist and stretch in impossible ways. Shapes moved at the edge of the light, tall, thin, and impossibly still. Their heads tilted unnaturally, and their blank, pale faces stared directly at him, though they made no sound. Emily screamed as one of the shapes glided closer. Its limbs were elongated, joints bending wrong, and its presence made the air feel thick, suffocating. Jason grabbed her hand and dragged her forward, heart pounding, every nerve screaming. Connor stumbled, calling for them, but his voice sounded distant, warped, swallowed by the fog. The trail twisted again and again, leading them in loops. Every time they thought they recognized a landmark, it vanished, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. And the figures, they were always there, patient, circling, never moving hastily, but always following. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Exhaustion overtook them, but there was no rest. Every attempt to hide or break away failed. At one point, Jason tripped over a fallen root and hit his head. When he regained his senses, Emily and Connor were gone. Panic consumed him. He ran blindly, branches clawing at his face, mud soaking his clothes. Then he saw them, not in the fog, but reflected in a shallow pool of water. Emily and Connor, their expressions twisted in impossible terror, their limbs bent unnaturally, faces frozen in silent screams. Jason gagged, stumbling backward, unable to look away. The whispers started then, layered, calling his name, coaxing him forward, promising the same fate. Jason ran until he found a narrow road at the edge of the forest. A passing hiker stopped, staring at him as he collapsed, drenched in sweat and mud, shaking, incoherent. Authorities later found Emily and Connor, bodies intact but horrifyingly frozen in expressions of pure terror, limbs twisted, eyes wide, mouths agape. The cause of death could not be explained. Jason moved far away, never hiking again, but the forest's memory never left him. At night, he hears whispers outside his window, feels a presence lingering in shadows, sees shapes moving just beyond his vision. He knows the forest waits, patient, intelligent, hunting, and he knows one day it will claim someone else foolish enough to enter Ravenwood Trail. Story the end.